Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we all know someone who is incredibly book smart, right? But they completely lack self-awareness. So how do psychologists actually put a number on that? Today, we are embarking on a masterclass journey into the fascinating world of psychological assessment, and we are going to teach this in depth. We're going far beyond the standard IQ tests and basic personality quizzes you might be used to. Instead, we're going to explore exactly how clinical psychologists measure the complex, intangible traits of the human experience. I mean, how do you calculate the exact quality of a person's life? We're going to dive into the precise clinical tools used to capture these invisible variables, making the unmeasurable measurable.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're looking at 1. Emotional intelligence. 2. Quality of life. 3. Stress and well-being. 4. Addiction assessment. And finally, 5. Suicide risk. Notice how we're escalating here, starting with everyday emotional metrics and moving all the way up to high-stakes, life-or-death clinical scenarios. Let's get into it. Section 1, Emotional Intelligence, Understanding Ourselves and Others. Okay, let's dive into this first domain. To really grasp emotional intelligence, or EI, we've got to look at its roots. The whole concept is basically a popularization of psychologist Howard Gardner's work. He talked about interpersonal intelligence, how well we read other people, and interpersonal intelligence, which is how well we understand ourselves. Clinically speaking, EI is defined as your capacity to perceive, understand, and manage emotions. And this is an absolute game changer in clinical psychology because it bridges a massive historical gap. For the longest time, traditional intelligence tests focused purely on cognitive horsepower, just raw brain power, completely leaving out these vital interpersonal and interpersonal variables. EI assessments step in to give us a much more integrated, holistic view of human functioning. So how do we actually divide and conquer this concept scientifically? Well, there are two major theoretical camps. First, you've got ability-based models. These treat emotional intelligence strictly as a cognitive ability. Think of it like a mental muscle used for the raw processing of emotional data. On the flip side, we have mixed or trait-based models. These take a much broader approach. They integrate those emotional processing abilities with your actual personality traits, things like your natural baseline for assertiveness or optimism. Which makes total sense, right? Because let's be real, logically processing an emotion and actually managing it with a sunny, optimistic attitude are two very, very different things. To really anchor your vocabulary, let's look at the exact clinical tools psychologists use out in the field. For adults, the gold standard is often the Barone Emotional Quotient Inventory, usually just called the Barone EQI. For the younger crowd, clinicians use the Emotional Intelligence Scale for children. And then there's this really fascinating one, the Ego Resiliency Scale, or ER89. The ER89 correlates heavily with sympathetic and socially adaptive traits. But a quick aside here, the science isn't totally settled. There is a massive ongoing debate in the psych community about whether these EI constructs are actually distinct from established personality dimensions like the famous Big Five. Are we measuring a brand new kind of intelligence or just putting a fresh coat of paint on standard personality traits? The debate is very much alive.
Moving on to Section 2, Quality of Life, the biopsychosocial impact. Think about this for a second. How do you actually quantify a good life? Quality of life is an incredibly complex, multifaceted construct. We're talking about evaluating variables like perceived stress, your level of loneliness, and how satisfied you are with your relationships and living conditions. In clinical psychology and medical research, say when we're studying the outcomes of a cancer treatment or a heart transplant, just measuring basic symptom reduction isn't enough anymore. We literally have to objectify the psychosocial benefits of these interventions to understand their true biopsychosocial impact on the patient's entire world.
And this brilliantly illustrates the two distinct methodologies clinicians use to measure this stuff. First up is the psychometric approach. The classic example here is the SF-36 Health Survey, which gives you separate, distinct scores across 8 different concepts, breaking down physical functioning, vitality, mental health, the whole shebang. It gives you a highly detailed profile. Conversely, the decision theory approach does something entirely different. It takes all those various health dimensions and weights them to produce one single unified expression of health status. The most common metric for this is the Quality Adjusted Life Year, or QALY. So, to put it simply, one gives you a complex dashboard of dials, and the other gives you a single bottom line score.
Section 3, Stress, Well-being, and Interests, targeting specific areas of adjustment. When we need to drill down into specific areas of a person's life, clinicians rely on highly specialized tools. For general psychological health and wellness, psychologists love to use the Satisfaction with Life Scale, SWLS, and the PANAS, that's the Positive and Negative Affect Schedule. Then we have test anxiety, which is a huge deal.
Severe test anxiety can actually artificially suppress a student's true cognitive scores, completely masking what they're truly capable of. To measure this, clinicians use the TICA, the Test Anxiety Inventory for Children and Adolescents, which is designed specifically for younger populations and those with learning disabilities. Finally, when evaluating career environments, tools like the Strong Interest Inventory or the Cooter Occupational Interest Survey help individuals identify work settings that actually promote job satisfaction and productivity. Now, here is a real game changer in how we measure stress. Ecological Momentary Assessment, or EMA. Historically, a patient had to sit in a sterile clinician's office and try to retroactively remember how stressed they were on Tuesday. EMA throws that out the window. It allows for the real-time monitoring of stress-related variables exactly where and when they happen, right in the patient's natural setting. By using the biopsychosocial model to track perceived stress and coping resources on the fly, clinicians get a vastly more accurate, high-definition picture of a patient's actual daily reality. Let's shift gears now for Section 4, Addiction Assessment, the Mechanics of Maintenance. As we move into more severe clinical realities, it's important to understand that addiction assessment is tiered. It definitely doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a brief screening. Tools like the audit, the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, or the MAST are designed purely for rapid identification. Just a quick check. But if those screens flag a problem, that's when clinicians roll out a comprehensive evaluation. The heavyweight tool here is the Addiction Severity Index, or ASI. This is an intense, structured interview assessing the patient across 7 distinct functional domains: medical, legal, social, you name it. Because, as we know, addiction doesn't exist in a vacuum. It profoundly impacts literally every facet of a person's life. So the crucial point is that modern addiction assessment has evolved way beyond simply checking a box to say a disorder is present. It's about deeply understanding the functional relationships that maintain that behavior. We do this through functional analysis, which focuses on the ABCs: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. We're looking at what triggers the behavior itself, and the ultimate payoff or fallout that follows. By mapping these ABCs, clinicians can fundamentally deconstruct the very mechanics of the addiction. And within that functional analysis, we absolutely have to look at cognitive variables. Tools like the Alcohol Expectancy Questionnaire evaluate what a patient actually expects to get out of drinking, alongside their true readiness to change. Why does this matter? Well, understanding these results is absolutely crucial because it directly guides systematic treatment selection. Grasping these cognitive factors helps clinicians figure out the exact restrictiveness of care necessary, and it helps spot any comorbid psychopathology, meaning other overlapping mental health issues that might violently interfere with their recovery. This brings us to our final and most serious topic, Section 5, Suicide Risk Assessment, High Stakes Prediction. When a clinician's objective is predicting self-destructive potential, strict clinical protocols and standardized instruments aren't just helpful, they are absolute requirements. Clinicians use scales like the Beck Hopelessness Scale and the Beck Suicide Scale to quantify risk factors. Plus, there are mandatory review points for any depressed patient, specifically critical items 2 and 9 on the BDI-2, as well as specific items on the MMMI-2. But listen, test scores alone are never enough. They must always be paired with a rigorous clinical interview. This deeply evaluates the patient's history of previous attempts, whether they have a specific plan, current major stressors like grief or a job loss, and the presence or complete lack of a social support system. At this level of clinical assessment, the ethical responsibilities are truly immense. Clinicians operate under what's called a strict duty to warn or protect. In these life-or-death situations, the absolute welfare of the patient completely overrides all standard confidentiality agreements. If an assessment yields high-risk findings, it necessitates immediate, sometimes drastic intervention. That could mean involuntary hospitalization or constant, unbroken supervision. The stakes simply could not be higher. However, and this is a critical point to understand, clinicians face a massive statistical nightmare in this endeavor. Suicide is what statisticians call a low base rate event. Because it is statistically rare in the broader general population, accurate prediction is incredibly difficult. This inherently creates a lot of false positives, meaning the assessment tools will inevitably identify many individuals as high risk who in reality would not have acted on those impulses. Because of this built-in flaw, assessment scores can never be blindly trusted. They must always be interpreted within the highly unique context of that specific individual's life history and exact current circumstances. Which leaves us to ponder some profound realities of clinical psychology. Given this inherent statistical challenge of false positives, knowing full well that our best predictive tools are scientifically imperfect, how do clinicians bear the heavy ethical weight of that duty to warn? When making a single psychological assessment could quite literally be the difference between life and death, how does one balance the cold science of statistics with the sanctity of human life? It's a heavy thought. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into how we measure the true intangibles of the human experience. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.